Every so often, a single moment, a simple act becomes the seed of something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It may begin unnoticed, hidden in the folds of everyday life, yet over time, it grows into something powerful enough to transform lives. This is not the story of a famous leader, a wealthy philanthropist, or a viral sensation. This is the story of a quiet, humble immigrant who stepped off a bus in a small, struggling town with nothing more than a backpack, a heavy heart, and an unwavering belief in kindness. He had no platform, no voice that echoed through media outlets, no followers. But he had something else, an innate desire to help, to offer something, however small, to the people around him. What began as a simple gesture would soon ripple outward, igniting a movement that reshaped a forgotten community, not through money, but through humanity. When Amir arrived in the fated town of Millstone, most of the shops were shuttered, the streets nearly silent, and the locals worn down by years of economic decline. The factory that once powered the town had closed 5 years earlier, taking with it hundreds of jobs and the community's spirit. People were tired, skeptical of outsiders, and too busy surviving to care about one more face. But Amir noticed things others overlooked: the elderly man who walked alone every morning, the single mother juggling 2 jobs, the local cafe owner who sat without customers. He started small. One morning, he helped carry groceries for a neighbor he didn't know. The next week, he began sweeping the sidewalk in front of the abandoned bookstore. At first, people stared. Who was this man? Why was he doing these things without asking for anything in return? But Amir kept going, quietly, consistently. He wasn't looking to impress. He simply believed that small good deeds mattered, and they do. Word began to spread slowly. Someone had seen Amir fixing a broken bench at the park. Another had watched him repaint a rusted mailbox on Main Street. Children started waving to him as he passed by. One day, a retired teacher approached him with curiosity and caution, asking why he was putting so much effort into a town that had given him nothing. Amir's response was simple: "This place is my home now. If I want to feel safe, welcome, and proud here, I have to help build that feeling." For others, that sentiment struck something deep. The teacher told her neighbors, who told theirs. People began to respond, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. A teen who had once loitered around the gas station joined Amir to repaint an old mural. A local baker started offering free coffee to anyone who volunteered for the weekend cleanups. The shift was subtle, yet undeniable. What was once decay began to feel like momentum. As more residents got involved, something beautiful happened. They began to see each other again. Connections that had once eroded under the pressure of daily struggles started to rebuild. People who had lived side by side for years but barely spoke began sharing stories, tools, and time. Amir never claimed to be a leader, but people naturally began looking to him for inspiration. He started organizing simple gatherings: a potluck in the park, a monthly story-sharing night at the library, a gardening group that repurposed a vacant lot into a blooming haven. These were not grand, expensive events, but they were rich in meaning. They gave people purpose, belonging, and pride. And amid all of this, something else began to return to Millstone: hope. It wasn't flashy, but it was real, and for many, that was more than enough. But as the town began to thrive again, questions about Amir's past began to surface. Who was he, really? Where had he come from, and what had brought him to Millstone in the first place? He never spoke much about the hardships he had faced or the country he had left behind. Some speculated he had lost family. Others thought he was escaping war or poverty. Whatever the truth, it was clear that Amir had channeled his pain into something generous and healing. And the more the community tried to understand his story, the more they realized it wasn't his past that defined him, it was the present. He helped create What began as a quiet act of kindness had become the cornerstone of a town's rebirth. And this was just the beginning. As the seasons passed, Amir's presence in Millstone evolved from curiosity to cornerstone. Children began calling him Mr. A nickname that spread affectionately through the community. He became a fixture in local routines, sweeping the same stretch of sidewalk each morning, stopping to chat with store owners, showing up at town hall meetings not to complain, but to listen. His humility stood out in a world that often rewards loudness. He never preached. He never asked for applause. But somehow, in his quietness, people heard him more clearly than anyone else. One chilly autumn afternoon, a small group of residents, inspired by Amir's consistent effort, gathered at the community center to discuss a volunteer project. The idea was simple: to create a shared community garden where people could grow vegetables, herbs, and flowers. Amir sat in the back, listening more than speaking. When the group looked to him for leadership, he gently reminded them, "This doesn't belong to me. This belongs to all of us." That statement became something of a motto. Over the next weeks, locals donated seeds, tools, and time. Retired farmers taught younger volunteers how to till the soil. Children painted colorful signs for each plant. Within a month, a once-abandoned lot blossomed into life. The garden became a gathering place, not just for food, but for connection. Neighbors who had been strangers began sharing recipes and laughter. On weekends, people brought instruments and played folk songs while others pulled weeds or harvested tomatoes. Stories were exchanged under the shade of a growing willow tree, planted by Amir himself. And slowly, Millstone stopped being a town people passed through. It became a place they wanted to stay, a place they felt proud of again. And Amir, though still modest and reserved, had become the beating heart of this quiet revolution. But not everyone embraced the change. Some longtime residents remained skeptical. They whispered that Amir's kindness must have an angle. Rumors bubbled beneath the surface that he was undocumented, that he had a criminal past, or that he was using the town for personal gain. These doubts weren't rooted in anything real, just fear. Fear of change, fear of difference, fear that someone from outside could hold more influence than those born and raised in Millstone. It hurt Amir, though he never showed it. He continued showing up with the same steady kindness, even to those who distrusted him. One evening, during a town meeting, an older man stood and voiced what others had only murmured. "Why do we trust someone we know nothing about?" he said, eyes scanning the room. The silence was heavy. Amir stood slowly and spoke in a voice as calm as ever. "I've never asked anyone to trust me blindly. I've only asked to be part of this community, just like you." Then he sat. It was all he said, and it was all he needed to say. That night, something shifted. The crowd didn't cheer. There were no fireworks, but a collective realization set in that trust isn't built in grand speeches. It's built in consistency, in shared effort, in small acts that stack up over time. Days later, the same man who had voiced suspicion stopped by the garden and handed Amir a set of tools. "You'll probably put these to better use than I ever did," he muttered before walking away. Amir didn't smile. He simply nodded with gratitude, because he understood that was the man's way of saying, "I see you now." And for Amir, being seen was enough. With growing trust came deeper conversations. People began asking Amir about his past, not out of suspicion, but genuine curiosity. He never shared much, but what he did reveal was powerful. He spoke of a childhood marked by loss, of fleeing his homeland under threat, of months in refugee camps and years spent navigating systems that weren't made for people like him. "I lost almost everything," he once told a young boy. "But when I got here, I realized I still had the most important thing, the ability to give." That line struck a chord. The local newspaper interviewed him, and though he resisted the attention, he agreed, hoping his words might help others. The article was titled "The Quiet Rebuilder," and it spread beyond Millstone. Nearby towns began reaching out, asking how they could start similar projects. College students arrived to study the community garden. Nonprofits sent donations and supplies. What began as one man picking up litter became a model for civic revival. Amir declined offers to run for office or accept awards. "This isn't about me," he said again and again. "It's about us, all of us." Millstone became a symbol, not just of recovery, but of what happens when people believe in one another again. Vacant storefronts reopened. Local art appeared on walls that once stood bare. Young people who had left town started returning, drawn back by the sense of community. And at the center of it all, Amir remained the same, steady, quiet, and unshakably kind. A man who had lost everything, yet gave everything, and in doing so, helped others find themselves. As winter settled over Millstone, Amir began to slow down. His hands, once so quick with tools and paint, moved a bit more carefully. The town noticed. They began organizing efforts without him, not because he was forgotten, but because his example had already been deeply absorbed. A group of teenagers repainted the community mural on their own. A young couple planted new crops in the garden, without being asked. An elderly woman who had once doubted Amir started organizing coat drives for those in need. The movement he sparked had become self-sustaining. One day, Amir didn't show up for his usual morning walk through town. People noticed. Calls were made. Within hours, neighbors were knocking on his door. He was fine, just tired, needing rest. The next day, a group showed up outside his home with soup, blankets, and warm smiles. They didn't ask for stories or explanations. They simply showed up, just like he always had. That winter, Millstone learned what Amir had quietly taught them all along. That community isn't built on big moments. It's built in quiet loyalty. In returning, again and again, for each other, the town surprised Amir that spring with a small celebration. Not a parade, not a festival, just a gathering at the community garden where people brought food, music, and words. Each person stood, one by one, and shared how his presence had changed their lives. There were tears, laughter, and silence. Amir sat listening, eyes wide with humility. When it was his turn to speak, he simply said, "Thank you for letting me belong." And that was enough. The years passed. Millstone continued to grow, to heal, to thrive. The community garden expanded into a farmer's market. A youth center opened in a building once condemned. Streets were lit not only by lamps, but by a spirit of shared pride. Amir grew older, but his spirit remained young. He was no longer a stranger, no longer an outsider. He was Mr. Aplay, the man who reminded everyone of what they had forgotten. That greatness often begins with a small act of courage, a gesture of compassion, a willingness to show up. Students who had grown up watching Amir now led their own projects. One girl started a reading circle at the library. A boy began organizing cleanups at the riverbank. They didn't need permission. They had already seen what was possible. Amir's influence had become part of Millstone's DNA. He wasn't just someone who changed the town. He became the blueprint for how others could do the same. And though his name may never be etched into national monuments or taught in history classes, those who knew him will never forget what he did. He reminded a tired town of its worth. He proved that one act, done with sincerity, could ripple across generations. And in the hearts of those he touched, Amir's legacy will live on, not as a hero in a headline, but as a neighbor, a friend, a quiet builder of hope. Years after Amir first arrived in Millstone, the story of the town's quiet transformation had reached well beyond its borders. Documentaries were made. University lectures quoted the millstone model. News outlets came and went, but Amir remained unchanged. He still walked the same streets, still tended the same garden, still helped carry groceries for elderly neighbors. And yet, people from around the world were now arriving to see what he had helped build. Some came out of curiosity, others came searching for answers to a question they had carried silently in their hearts. Is it possible for one person to truly make a difference? Among the visitors was a young woman named Leela, herself a recent immigrant, who had heard Amir's story while watching a late-night feature in her dorm room. She was studying community development but felt lost between theory and reality, between policy and people. When she stepped into Millstone, she didn't find a perfect town. She found one still learning, still failing, and trying again. But she also found warmth, belonging, and honesty. She asked Amir for guidance, expecting lectures. He gave her something simpler, an invitation to help plant strawberries in the garden. If you want to know how to build a community, he said, start by getting your hands in the soil. That moment became pivotal for Leela. She stayed in Millstone for 3 months, living with a local family, working alongside volunteers, and recording stories. She went on to create a nonprofit focused on grassroots change, led by displaced people. Immigrants, refugees, and others, too often treated as burdens instead of builders. And she credited it all to Amir. But when she returned years later to thank him, Amir simply smiled and said, "You didn't need me. You just needed someone to believe it was possible." His humility, once again, left the deepest impression. As Amir aged, he rarely spoke about his legacy. He never wrote a memoir or accepted honorary titles, but others did it for him. Students published essays, artists painted murals. Local filmmakers compiled hours of footage into a documentary titled A Quiet Seed. In the film, people of all ages shared how one man's consistency gave them permission to believe again in kindness, in action, in each other. The documentary won small awards, but more importantly, it stirred emotions in classrooms, churches, and community centers. Viewers wept, not because Amir was extraordinary, but because he was ordinary and still made an extraordinary impact. The town, once defined by factory closures and quiet despair, had transformed into a place known for resilience and renewal. City planners from distant towns visited to learn from its journey. College interns arrived every summer. And through it all, Amir remained grounded. His days still began with tea, a walk, and tending to the garden that had long outgrown him. Children now played where weeds once grew, and every flower that bloomed felt like a thank you note written in color. One summer evening, the town council proposed renaming the community center in Amir's honor. The motion passed unanimously. But when Amir was invited to the unveiling, he hesitated. "This isn't mine," he told the mayor. "It belongs to the people." The mayor responded softly, "And that's exactly why it should carry your name." On the day of the ceremony, Amir stood quietly beside the sign that now read Amir Center for Community Growth. He said little, but his eyes told a story of a man humbled not by fame, but by the ripple of goodness that had grown around him. With time, Amir's health began to fade. He moved more slowly, needed more rest, and was occasionally seen with a cane. The town adjusted its rhythm to match his. Volunteers began showing up early to open the garden gates for him. A young boy learned to prepare Amir's favorite tea. Even the local bus would sometimes wait an extra minute if he was approaching. These small gestures mirrored the very philosophy Amir had lived by: attention to the quiet needs, the unnoticed kindnesses. When he passed away one quiet spring morning, the entire town felt it. The silence was not heavy with sorrow, but full of reverence. People gathered at the garden, placing flowers, candles, hay, and handwritten notes at the base of the willow tree he had planted years ago. Stories were exchanged about the time Amir helped fix a broken bicycle, or listened patiently to someone grieving, or shared half of his sandwich with a stray dog. These were not heroic tales in the traditional sense, but to those who lived them, they were everything. The town didn't hold a grand funeral. Amir would not have wanted that. Instead, they organized something he would have loved, a day of service. No speeches, no cameras, just people helping one another, quietly and fully. The garden was tended, fences repaired, meals delivered to Shutins, and in every gesture, his spirit lived on. That day became an annual tradition, known simply as Amir Day, not a holiday, a habit. A way of remembering that even in absence, kindness leaves footprints. Years after his passing, children in Millstone still grow up hearing about Mr. Not as a myth, but as someone real, someone whose photo hangs in the library with a simple quote, "Do the small thing with full heart." Teachers use his story to teach empathy. Parents reference him when guiding their kids through difficult choices. His life became a compass, not just for the town, but for others beyond it. Communities across the country and even abroad began adopting small act days, encouraging citizens to engage in quiet service, to look around and ask, "What can I do for someone today?" A school in a distant country named a classroom after Amir. A podcast series featured stories of people replicating his model in urban neighborhoods, refugee camps, and forgotten rural towns. One story told of a man in South America who started sweeping his street every morning after watching a quiet seed. Within a year, his neighborhood transformed, not because of funding, but because of faith in one another. He said, "I never met Amir, but I feel like I know him." That was Amir's gift, to create connection where there had once been distance. Even those who never heard his name directly were touched by his echo. Acts of kindness, unexpected, unannounced, and uncelebrated, began to bloom like wildflowers in the lives of those willing to try. And, as the world around Millstone grew more complex, more divided, the town held firm to the truth it had learned through one man's life, that healing doesn't always come from above. Sometimes it starts with someone kneeling in the dirt, planting something no one else can see yet, and believing it will grow. In the end, Amir's story is not a tale of heroism in the traditional sense. It's a reminder that ordinary people, the ones we pass on the street, the ones who speak softly and act slowly, can carry within them the power to reshape the world. He did not start a revolution. He tended to one, carefully, patiently, through muddy days and cold mornings, through moments of doubt and quiet triumphs. Amir showed that the foundation of a strong community is not built in steel or stone, but in compassion repeated daily. So what do we take from this? That you too can be Amir. Not in fame, not in imitation, but in spirit. In the willingness to show up. In the choice to offer a small act of care without expecting recognition. In the belief that kindness, though fragile, is also fiercely contagious. You don't need money, power, or permission. You just need the courage to begin. Perhaps the greatest tribute to Amir is not in what was named after him, but in what lives on because of him. In a girl who opens the door for someone with full hands. In a boy who checks on his neighbor after a storm. In a stranger who stops to listen instead of rushing past. These moments may never make the news, but they are the quiet revolutions that hold communities together. So the next time you wonder whether a small act matters, remember Millstone. Remember Amir, and then take one step. Open your heart, extend a hand. The ripple begins with you. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who believes or needs to believe that small acts still matter. Subscribe for more real stories that remind us what humanity looks like at its best. And in the comments, tell us what's one small act of kindness you've witnessed or done lately. You never know who you might inspire.